By sunrise, the celebration had soured. And no one could explain why. Sirens hummed in the distance. The crowd's laughter had turned brittle. Glasses shattered on concrete, sending shards like frozen fire across the pavement. A man in a tailored coat stood at the edge of the plaza. His hands shook, not from cold, but from the impossible awareness that everything was shifting. "You've felt this before." The air carrying a warning you can't name. A city street bathed in the soft glow of neon, yet every shadow seemed alive. But the real story hadn't even started. Inside a nearby diner, a waitress wiped down counters she had cleaned 1,000 times. Her eyes, tired but sharp, caught a flicker on the television mounted above the soda machine. A scandal. Or at least, that's what the news anchor said. At first, it seemed like nothing. Just another conflict in a world that thrived on chaos. But one detail refused to sit still. One fragment of information shattered the morning like a dropped egg on hot pavement. Outside, the crowd murmured in confusion. A single man shouted, his voice slicing through the morning mist. "They lied. Everything we believed, it was a lie." The streetlights flickered. A door clicked shut somewhere behind him. A shadow moved, faster than human reaction, slipping between cars. No one knew who to trust. No one could know what had truly begun. Because beneath the noise, beneath the shouting, a system had already started moving. And it wasn't waiting for permission. What he found next changed everything. And for the first time, the people realized the stakes weren't just political. They were personal. You know this feeling. The one where the world tilts just slightly, and you can't tell up from down. Where a truth, once hidden, becomes a question you cannot unask. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of the city waking up, someone whispered. The real danger isn't change, it's who defines what normal looks like. By the time the sun rose fully, the plaza was empty. Glass and paper littered the ground like confetti at a parade that had never existed. And yet, no one could stop thinking about what had just happened. Because the real story hadn't even started. He had grown up in a small town where the highways seemed to stretch forever, and the neon signs of diners were the only proof the world was awake after dark. The smell of frying bacon and coffee filled the air before sunrise, a comforting ritual that made everything feel predictable. But life had never been predictable for him. As a boy, he carried a scar across his left hand, a jagged memory from a moment he had long tried to forget. A mistake, a broken window, a door slammed in anger. It was a mark of imperfection, a private reminder that consequences had a way of finding you, even when you thought you had escaped. His name was Garrett. To the outside world, he was just another figure among thousands chasing headlines and deals in the city's polished towers. But beneath that polished exterior, a quiet storm had been growing. Something restless, something that refused to fit neatly into anyone's expectations. He had dreams that didn't quite match reality. Nights spent staring out over the city lights from his cramped apartment, wondering if someone, somewhere, was telling the truth. A child's curiosity had turned into a man's obsession, to see the strings behind the puppet show, to understand the machinery of influence and power. You've seen this before. That moment when someone's gaze lingers on more than the surface. When they notice the tension in a room, the flicker of fear in a colleague's eye, the way a single lie can ripple outward like a dropped stone in still water. Garrett's life had always been a series of paradoxes. He wanted order, but thrived in chaos. He craved recognition, but feared exposure. He longed to connect, yet built walls higher than any skyscraper. And yet, despite these contradictions, or maybe because of them, he was about to step into a storm that would test the very foundation of everything he thought he knew. The first sign had been subtle. A whisper over a late-night news broadcast. A name mentioned in passing. A hint that the network of influence he had been chasing for years had begun to fracture. At first, he ignored it. The world was full of whispers. Full of claims that seemed urgent in the moment, but meaningless in the light of day. But something in him was shifting. A tension he had carried his whole life, between curiosity and caution, between hope and cynicism, began to snap into focus. He started noticing patterns others dismissed. The way city lights seemed to flicker differently over certain districts, almost like signals. The way conversations ended abruptly when someone too close to the truth appeared. The reports he had trusted suddenly contained gaps, deliberate omissions, whispers that carried more meaning than the words themselves. And then came the first real confrontation. A colleague he had trusted, someone who had laughed at the same roadside diners, argued over the same factory floor deals, shared the same late-night pizza, looked him dead in the eye and said, "You're not ready for this. You don't even know what's at stake." Garrett had always believed he could handle anything. He had been wrong. There was a moment in that crowded office, filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scent of stale coffee, when he realized the scale of the system he was stepping into. It wasn't just a network of people, of deals, of influence. It was an ecosystem of deception. Of loyalty traded for convenience. Of truths curated to fit comfort rather than reality. And in that moment, Garrett felt the weight of imperfection, his own, and everyone else's, pressing down like a storm cloud over the skyline. He had choices. Retreat into ignorance, or step forward into the unknown. You've asked this question too. When does curiosity become courage? When does the pursuit of truth outweigh the safety of silence? He didn't know yet. He could only feel the pull. The subtle urgency, the quiet insistence that the world was about to change, and he had to decide whether to watch it unfold, or to be the one holding the lens. Because one thing was certain, the fractures he had begun to notice weren't going to wait. They spread quietly, invisibly, like cracks in the foundation of a city built on appearances. And Garrett realized, this wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about victories or losses, applause or outrage. It was about understanding the machinery, the invisible forces that had shaped his life since the boy with the scar had first looked out over those endless highways. And he had no choice but to follow it, wherever it led. At first, everything seemed normal. The city breathed like it always had, horns in the distance, streetlights flickering on schedules only engineers could understand, the hum of subway tunnels beneath the asphalt. Garrett walked among it all, notebook in hand, coffee cooling in the cup he never finished. Patterns teased him from the corner of his vision. A meeting cancelled at the last second. An email that never reached its recipient. A rumor dismissed as coincidence, but now impossible to ignore. At first, the reports looked normal. Then a single detail fractured everything. The detail came in the form of an envelope. Plain. Brown. Sealed with tape that smelled faintly of varnish and mystery. No return address. No explanation. Just his name scrawled in careful, deliberate handwriting, Garrett L. Inside, a series of photographs, documents, and a USB drive. What he found next changed everything. The photos were of familiar faces, caught in moments that never should have been public. Private conversations, whispered deals, traces of ambition and fear laid bare. The documents hinted at alliances and betrayals so intricate, so carefully choreographed, that it was impossible to untangle truth from fabrication at first glance. And the USB drive? A collection of files, emails, spreadsheets, recordings, that painted a network operating beneath the surface, invisible yet omnipresent. At first, he wanted to turn away. To close the files, discard the evidence, and pretend he had never seen any of it. But he couldn't. Curiosity had become a weight he could not set down. The city outside seemed to sense it too. Lights flickered as he walked. Voices rose and fell, carried on the wind like fragments of a conversation he wasn't meant to hear. And somewhere, a door clicked shut. Each step he took through the streets, the coffee shops, the diner corners, felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon no one had ever mapped. At first, the pattern seemed clear. Then it twisted. He noticed contradictions that defied logic, the same players operating on opposite sides, rules bending for some while crushing others, loyalty offered in whispers, betrayal hidden in plain sight. The moral pressure mounted. Every decision he made felt consequential. Every action, no matter how small, had the potential to ripple outward in ways he could not predict. You felt this before. That unease when the world no longer makes sense, when what you trusted becomes suspect, when every step forward feels like walking through fog thick enough to choke on. Garrett's colleagues started behaving differently. Some avoided him entirely. Others watched him too closely, their eyes heavy with questions they didn't ask aloud. He realized the rules had changed. The system didn't announce its shifts. It didn't ask for consent. It simply moved, and everyone else had to follow, or break. At night, he stared at the skyline from his apartment. The lights glimmered, a city of millions, each one unknowingly part of the same web. And for the first time, he understood the scale of the storm he had stumbled into. There was one detail everyone missed. One thread that, if pulled, could unravel everything. He didn't know yet if it was courage or recklessness that made him reach for it. But he did. Because at that moment, Garrett realized, the danger wasn't just the system itself. The danger was who controlled the definition of normal. Who decided what could be said, what could be believed, and who would be punished for asking questions. Screens lit up across the city. Voices sharpened in online forums, in coffee shops, in late-night news segments. No one agreed on what was real anymore. And yet, amidst the chaos, Garrett felt a strange clarity. The system was fragile. The cracks were widening. And if he could navigate them, just barely, he could illuminate the truth. But someone, somewhere, had anticipated this. Every move he made had already been considered. Every doubt planted, every fear leveraged. And then, nothing made sense. At the peak of the night, with the city quieting only in appearance, he understood the first real rule: survival in this network required more than intelligence or courage. It demanded instinct, observation, timing, and a willingness to confront not just others' deception, but the compromises he had long made himself. The tension was no longer abstract. It had teeth. And it was closing in. Because the storm had begun, and Garrett, for better or worse, was already in its eye. It wasn't supposed to be visible. The machinery. The network. The invisible lines that connected every decision, every lie, every whispered threat. Garrett had always believed in the obvious: deals made in boardrooms, conversations overheard at diners, leaks that appeared by accident. But the truth was orchestrated chaos. He started tracing connections. Names, dates, locations. Patterns emerged. Subtle at first, like a faint pulse beneath the hum of the city. Then undeniable. What they called freedom, was quiet dependency. What they called choice, was carefully curated chaos. What they celebrated as loyalty, had been manipulated, tested, and traded like currency. He leaned over his desk, eyes scanning dozens of spreadsheets and photographs. Each one revealed a paradox, a contradiction designed to fracture certainty. People he trusted implicitly were pawns. People he distrusted were shields. And in the middle of it all, a single thread wound through everything: influence. Not power, not money, not politics, pure influence. The ability to define what others believed, what they feared, what they would defend. And here's the part almost no one saw: the system didn't need to force compliance. It only needed to appear natural. The rules bent themselves around perception. Control was subtle. Almost invisible. Garrett remembered the diner from his childhood. The highways stretching like veins through the city. The neon lights flickering over cracked pavement. Every ordinary sight now felt like part of the stage. There were recordings he hadn't yet listened to. Voices, some familiar, some unknown, discussing events he had witnessed but never questioned. Their words were calm, casual, detached. But behind them, strategy, planning, calculated manipulation. And then he saw it. The line he hadn't noticed at first. A single signature in a document, a recurring name in emails, a pattern of minor events building toward a major fracture. It hit him like a punch. Someone had planned every move he had observed. Every reaction he thought spontaneous. Every coincidence was deliberate. The emotional shock wasn't anger. It was awe. The scale, the precision, the invisible choreography, it was terrifying in its elegance. But even as his mind raced, Garrett recognized a subtle opportunity. For every deception, there was an oversight. For every layer of control, a crack in the foundation. And in that realization, he found clarity. The system had rules, yes, but it had rules that could be bent, tested, exploited. The philosophical sting landed hard. The real danger wasn't the deception itself. It was the belief that it couldn't be seen. The belief that the puppet master was untouchable. Garrett understood now what he had been chasing all along, not just the truth, but the pattern. Not just the lies, but the logic behind them. And as he pieced it together, a singular thought echoed. The truth didn't break them. Their denial did. Across the city, lights flickered again. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A single window in a skyscraper revealed a shadow staring out, watching, calculating. Garrett felt the weight of responsibility. Not just to himself, but to everyone who had been quietly entangled in the system's design. The reveal wasn't dramatic in the sense of spectacle. It was quiet, precise, devastatingly human. A whisper in the mind that unsettled everything you thought you knew. And in that quiet, he realized, the storm he had feared wasn't coming. It was already here. And he was standing in the eye of it. You felt this once, didn't you? That sudden awareness that the world operates on rules you only half understand. That the ordinary is often a mask for the extraordinary. Garrett didn't speak aloud. He didn't need to. The system had been revealed. And now, the next move belonged to him. Screens lit up across the city like fireflies gone rogue. Voices sharpened, overlapping, drowning out reason. No one agreed on what was real anymore. Garrett ran through the streets. The rain had started, a soft drizzle at first, then sharp, slicing the neon reflections on asphalt. He could feel it on his face, but it barely registered. Nothing registered. The emails. The photographs. The whispers. They weren't just evidence. They were a mirror. A mirror reflecting his own compromises. His own quiet agreements to look away, to ignore, to rationalize. You can silence a voice. You can bury a truth. But you cannot stop a mind that finally learns to question. He turned a corner, narrowly avoiding a taxi that skidded through the slick street. The city seemed alive, judging him, testing him. The storm wasn't just rain, it was consequence. It was moral pressure made tangible. People shouted in the streets. Some for clarity. Some for revenge. Some because they didn't know why they shouted at all. And Garrett realized, he was alone. In the eye of the storm, clarity came at the cost of isolation. Screens flashed accusations, conspiracies, predictions. Every channel, every feed, every platform carried a version of the truth, and all of them were incomplete. All of them manipulated. A sudden thought hit him, the system didn't just shape events. It shaped perception. And perception shaped reality. The moral tension became unbearable. Every choice he had made led him here. Every hesitation, every action, every ignored warning, it had all compounded into a moment he could not escape. At a diner, a single waitress watched him from behind the counter. Her hands paused mid-wipe. "You look like someone who's seen too much," she said. He nodded, but didn't speak. Words felt useless. Voices filled his head. He remembered the boy with the scar, staring at endless highways, dreaming of understanding the invisible rules. He remembered the man he had become, walking into chaos he could barely comprehend. Screens flickered. Doors opened. A shadow crossed a street and vanished. Pressure waves hit him. Every instinct screamed, retreat, hide, surrender. Every part of him knew, that would be a mistake. Because the storm demanded a choice. Not just of survival. Of courage. Of identity. And in that choice, something broke open. The fear, the hesitation, the private compromises, they all shattered under the weight of clarity. Garrett finally saw it, the system could bend perception, manipulate outcomes, hide its logic. But it could not touch resolve. It could not extinguish awareness. The rain washed over him. The city roared around him. And for the first time, he felt not panic, but awakening. You felt this before. That singular moment when fear becomes focus. When doubt transforms into determination. When the chaos around you becomes the compass within you. He understood the paradox. To confront a system this vast, this intricate, he had to embrace its chaos, not flee from it. He had to navigate it, anticipate it, challenge it. And he knew, with piercing clarity, that this storm was only the beginning. What he had uncovered wasn't isolated. It was a pattern. A network. A force shaping everyone's reality, quietly, invisibly, relentlessly. And Garrett, scarred, human, imperfect, was now part of it. No longer as a pawn. Not yet a master. But as a witness. And a challenger. Screens lit up again. Voices sharpened. The city did not pause. But Garrett's mind had. Focused. Clear. Alert. The storm raged. And inside him, a new storm was rising. Freedom, he realized, wasn't inherited. It wasn't granted. It was claimed, through awareness, through action, through courage. So when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? And maybe, this is where everything begins again. The city slowly exhaled. Morning light pierced the clouds, soft and deliberate, painting puddles in gold. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glimmering like black glass. And in the quiet aftermath, Garrett walked alone. He wasn't triumphant. He wasn't victorious. He was aware. Awareness carried its own gravity. It pulled at him with a weight that no applause could lift, no recognition could soothe. Because what he had witnessed wasn't simply corruption, manipulation, or chaos. It was humanity in its most vulnerable, most stubborn form. You know this feeling. The one where the world doesn't pause, but you notice it differently. Where a single choice feels magnified, meaningful, and dangerous all at once. Garrett stopped at a diner he had known since childhood. The neon sign flickered softly. The smell of coffee, fried eggs, and bacon greeted him like an old friend. Life, ordinary and persistent, continued around him. But everything had changed. He thought of the storm, the revelations, the hidden systems he had uncovered. He thought of the choices that lay ahead. And he realized, freedom isn't inherited. It's practiced. Every day, through awareness. Through questioning. Through refusing to accept the definitions others imposed. Screens and voices no longer controlled him. The storm could rage. It could attempt to bend perception. It could hide the truth beneath layers of narrative. But Garrett had learned the pattern. He had learned the rhythm. And he had learned himself. So when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? He took a seat at the counter, alone but not lonely. A cup of coffee steamed in front of him. Outside, the city pulsed with life, chaotic, beautiful, alive. And maybe, this is where everything begins again. Because the system, the storm, the hidden forces, they would not disappear. But neither would the ones who dared to see them. Those who questioned, who acted, who refused to surrender. Garrett lifted the cup, breathed deeply, and let the warmth anchor him. He had survived the storm. Not unscathed, not certain, but awake. And for now, that was enough. The light lingered on puddles. On streets. On city corners that seemed mundane but were, in truth, part of something greater. And in that quiet, heavy, reflective space, the truth revealed itself. Change is relentless. Awareness is rare. Courage is everything. The calm never lasted. It never does. By mid-morning, the city had resumed its rhythm. Horns blared, subways groaned, and coffee shops filled with the mundane chatter of strangers who didn't know the storm had passed, or that it hadn't. Garrett walked past a diner, noticing the same waitress who had once whispered a warning. She nodded subtly, as if acknowledging a truth she dared not speak aloud. He felt the weight of observation pressing down on him again. The system was patient, and it waited. And then he saw it. A message, hidden in plain sight. Not on a screen. Not in an envelope. It was a casual post on a public forum, written in offhand language, almost invisible, almost dismissible. Except for Garrett. He knew. It contained a fragment of information. A connection that seemed insignificant to anyone else but was, in truth, the missing link between two events he had been tracking for weeks. One subtle detail, a timestamp, a location, a single word repeated in a way that suggested design rather than coincidence. At first, he hesitated. Could this be a trap? A test? Or was it genuine insight? There was one detail everyone missed. And Garrett wasn't about to ignore it. He followed the thread, digging deeper into forums, private chats, obscure posts. The deeper he went, the more patterns emerged. People moved like chess pieces, seemingly unrelated but connected by invisible lines. Decisions made in one city rippled across another. A whisper in one diner echoed in a boardroom thousands of miles away. You've felt this before. The awareness that someone, or something, is always one step ahead. That what appears random is often deliberate. The city itself seemed complicit. Streetlights blinked. Subway announcements repeated phrases that had no meaning until you recognized them as signals. Even the pigeons, roosting atop statues, seemed to scatter at precise moments. Garrett realized the fracture was bigger than he had imagined. This wasn't an isolated system, a localized deception. It was a sprawling, adaptive network capable of learning from exposure, predicting responses, and manipulating outcomes without ever being seen. And yet, there was hope. Every system has weaknesses. Every pattern has gaps. Every network leaves breadcrumbs. Garrett spotted one. A contradiction in a chain of messages. A repeated name, slightly misaligned timestamps, an error no one else noticed. It wasn't much. But in a system this vast, a small crack could widen fast. And that's when the first threat arrived. Not in person. Not on a screen. It came in the subtle changes of behavior around him. Colleagues he thought neutral now avoided him. Strangers lingered too long in doorways, watching. Voices paused mid-conversation when he entered a room. The moral tension returned, heavier than before. Every move he made now had consequences not only for himself but for the delicate pattern he had begun to trace. Every question he asked, every curiosity followed, could trigger retaliation, or worse, mislead him entirely. But Garrett had changed. The storm had left him alert, resilient, awake. The fractures were no longer intimidating, they were opportunities. The network could adapt, but he could anticipate. And the first pull of awareness hit him like lightning. To understand the network, he had to immerse in it. To survive the fracture, he had to think like it. To expose it, he had to become the eye in the storm without losing himself. And maybe, that was the most dangerous step of all. Because the deeper he went, the more he realized. The fracture wasn't just in the system. It was in people. In trust. In perception. In themselves. And if the fracture widened too far, no one, not even Garrett, could contain it. By midday, the fractures Garrett had noticed were no longer subtle. They rippled outward like tremors through the city. Traffic lights faltered in one district. Subway trains delayed in another. Screens flashed conflicting alerts. Ordinary routines cracked under the weight of invisible forces. And people noticed. Some panicked. Some ignored it. Some whispered, unsure if it was real, or imagined. Garrett moved through it all, eyes scanning, mind mapping. Every anomaly, every hesitation, every shadow became data. Every mistake, intentional or not, became a clue. At a coffee shop, a barista dropped a cup. It shattered on the floor. The sound echoed. And for a moment, Garrett understood the pattern in chaos. Disruption demanded attention. Small disruptions escalated into fear. Fear dictated behavior. Behavior created outcomes. He followed the trail to a series of emails he hadn't noticed before, each one coded in subtle shifts of language. A single word changed in each message. A slight misalignment of punctuation. At first, it seemed meaningless. Then he realized, it was signaling someone, somewhere, monitoring the system as he was. At first, he considered retreating. He had survived the storm. He had seen the reveal. He had walked through the eye. Why risk exposure now? But curiosity, now sharpened into instinct, refused to let him stop. You felt this before. The moment where hesitation feels heavier than action. When inaction becomes complicity. And action, Garrett realized, carried weight. Consequences. Responsibility. He decided to trace the ripple, following the cracks through emails, social threads, and late-night messages. It led him to a small group, unknown allies, or perhaps actors in a larger game. Their messages were cryptic, layered with warnings and insight. And then came the first confrontation. A colleague, someone he had trusted for months, appeared in his apartment building lobby. Eyes darting, voice low. You shouldn't be here, the colleague whispered. You don't understand what's happening. Garrett stared. He did. But the understanding came with risk. The city outside pulsed with energy. Streetlights flickered. Neon glimmered on wet pavement. Life continued, or seemed to. And in the quiet tension, Garrett understood a truth he hadn't yet faced. The fracture wasn't just technological. It wasn't just structural. It was human. Human decisions, human mistakes, human fear. And the more he learned, the more he realized, every action, every exposure, every revelation created ripples. Some helpful. Some destructive. And some, irreversible. The moral tension was suffocating. Every choice was both key and threat. Every revelation could illuminate, or destabilize. And Garrett understood this instinctively. To navigate the fracture, he had to master it, predict it, anticipate it. He had to move before the ripple became a wave. The city hummed. The screens flickered. And Garrett, scarred, awake, alert, felt the weight of responsibility like never before. Because he had stepped into the fracture. And now, the fracture was stepping into him. Night fell quickly, as if the city itself was impatient. Shadows stretched long across empty streets. Garrett's footsteps echoed against the brick walls of alleys he barely recognized, streets he had walked 1,000 times. Yet tonight, every corner felt charged, alive, watching. He had followed the ripple far enough to know its origin, a meeting, off the record, in a warehouse at the edge of the industrial district. No cameras. No witnesses. Only the people orchestrating the fractures he had been tracing. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. The smell of oil, metal, and damp concrete filled his lungs. A single fluorescent light hummed overhead. And in the center, 3 figures waited. They didn't smile. They didn't speak first. They simply watched. "You shouldn't be here," one said finally, voice low but firm. "You've seen too much." Garrett swallowed, steadying the weight in his chest. "I've seen what's happening," he said. "And I want to understand it." The tension thickened. Every pause carried threat. Every glance was a test. And Garrett realized, understanding came with danger. "You think this is about knowledge?" another figure asked. "You think seeing patterns gives you control? Control is an illusion. The system doesn't need control. It needs belief. And once belief is broken, everything collapses." Garrett felt the pull of fear. It wrapped around him like a steel coil. And yet, beneath it, curiosity burned brighter than ever. "You've felt this before. The moment when survival and morality collide. When doing the right thing feels like stepping into the abyss." One of the figures stepped closer. "Every decision you make affects people," they said. "Some you save. Some you destroy. Do you even know which is which?" The weight of responsibility hit him like a physical force. The ethical dilemma was clear: intervene and risk catastrophe, or step back and let the fracture widen unchecked. Garrett remembered the diner, the highways, the rain-soaked streets. He remembered the storm, the reveal, the awakening. Every choice had led him here. And every choice from this moment forward would define not only the system but himself. The figures watched silently as he considered. Time slowed. A single drop of water fell from a leaky pipe, echoing in the vast space. The sound seemed louder than the voices. And then Garrett made his choice. Not a decision of fear. Not a decision of convenience. A decision of clarity. "I will follow the ripple," he said. "I will trace it. I will expose it. And I will take responsibility for whatever comes." A silence fell. The kind that feels heavier than any words. The figures exchanged glances, a mixture of respect and warning. "You have chosen," one said softly. "And with choice comes consequence. Prepare yourself." Garrett left the warehouse with the weight of inevitability on his shoulders. Every streetlight, every echoing footstep, every shadow seemed more alive. The fracture was no longer abstract. It had a face. It had reach. And Garrett was now fully entangled. Outside, the city pulsed, oblivious. And yet, in its rhythm, Garrett could feel the cracks spreading faster. The moral and ethical tension was no longer theoretical, it was visceral. And every step forward would demand more courage than the last. The city had grown quiet, deceptively so. Streetlights hummed, buzzing softly above streets slick with rain. Shadows stretched across asphalt like ink spilled by a careless hand. Garrett moved through it all with purpose, notebook in hand, senses sharpened by weeks of observation. Every step mattered. Every choice had consequences he could not yet measure. The fracture he had uncovered was alive. It was sprawling. And it was watching. At first, he began small. He observed routines. Subtle patterns in people's behavior. The timing of emails. The cadence of conversations. He noted who hesitated, who spoke too quickly, who glanced at screens with an almost imperceptible tension. Even the hum of subway trains carried information, pauses, delays, signals invisible to anyone else. He began to map these anomalies, drawing connections like constellations across a night sky. Some stars formed obvious shapes. Some patterns twisted unpredictably, refusing categorization. The fracture was alive, chaotic, but not random. Then came the first act of influence. A post, crafted with meticulous care, appeared on a public forum. Words that seemed ordinary carried hidden meaning. Subtle enough to evade casual readers. Powerful enough to provoke reaction in those trained to see it. For hours, nothing happened. He checked again. And then, a ripple. A delayed message. A misaligned schedule. A reaction he had predicted, yet still jolted him with its precision. The system noticed him. And Garrett noticed that it was learning from him as much as he was learning from it. You felt this before. That moment when observation becomes engagement. When curiosity crosses the line into action. When every instinct, every risk, sharpens into clarity. Next, he tested human behavior. He reached out to a colleague he had never fully trusted, planting questions disguised as casual conversation. He watched responses. Tone. Hesitation. Choice of words. Every subtle cue revealed patterns, contradictions, and misalignments in the system he had begun to trace. The fracture was no longer abstract. It had human tendrils. Humans made mistakes. Humans reacted unpredictably. And Garrett exploited that, carefully, deliberately. Outside, the city pulsed with normalcy. Cars hummed along wet asphalt. Subway trains groaned beneath the surface. Pedestrians walked purposefully, oblivious to the invisible chessboard stretching above their heads. Even pigeons scattered in formations that seemed almost deliberate. Garrett paused at a diner he had frequented since childhood. The aroma of coffee and fried eggs grounded him. He noticed subtle shifts, a barista hesitated before placing a cup, a patron's gaze lingered too long. Small details. Tiny deviations. Yet they mapped the fracture with more precision than any file or spreadsheet could. And then he realized the critical truth. The fracture wasn't just structural or systemic. It was human. The network lived in choices, in hesitation, in fear. And every human error, no matter how minor, could be leveraged. So he acted again. A careful email to a colleague. A seemingly innocuous comment on a public forum. A subtle adjustment to a schedule he had mapped meticulously. All designed to test reactions, predict outcomes, and manipulate movement. At first, it felt almost like playing chess blindfolded. He made moves without seeing the full board, but he sensed the patterns emerging. He saw the responses ripple outward. The fracture responded. The network learned. And Garrett adapted. Hours passed. He didn't rest. He didn't eat. He barely noticed the night folding into dawn. Small victories accumulated. A single thread had been pulled. A reaction unfolded as he had predicted. The fracture had revealed a crack, and Garrett knew how to exploit it. But he also understood the risk. Every action he took made him visible. Every step drew attention, subtle but inevitable. Every choice had consequences, both anticipated and unknown. And yet he persisted. The storm wasn't over. The fracture was far from healed. But Garrett had discovered something vital: influence within the fracture was possible. Not power. Not control. Awareness. Anticipation. Precision. He had begun to bend the fracture toward clarity. To move the invisible machinery, without being crushed by it. The city outside awoke. Streetlights flickered in rhythm with the dawn. Cars roared along the avenues. Pedestrians went about their lives, unaware of the game unfolding around them. Garrett watched, breathing deeply, noting patterns, mapping the next moves. He understood one immutable truth. To master the fracture, he had to think like it. Move like it. Predict like it. And remain human. For the fracture was patient. It would wait. It would test him. It would push back in ways he could not yet imagine. But Garrett was ready. Alert. Focused. Determined. And in that moment, he knew the first victory was not the pull of a thread, it was surviving it with clarity intact. By mid-morning, the city seemed normal. But Garrett knew better. Normalcy was a mask. A fragile veneer stretched over fractures he had begun to exploit. The first consequences arrived quietly. A colleague missed a meeting without explanation. A scheduled delivery was delayed for hours. A conversation he overheard in a diner shifted unexpectedly, laced with suspicion. At first, he brushed it off. Coincidence, he told himself. Patterns, he reminded himself, were never obvious at the start. But then, the first direct warning. A note slipped under his apartment door. No envelope. No signature. Just words, typed and precise. Stop. Or it will get worse. The message carried a weight beyond its letters. It wasn't a threat, it was a reminder. Someone knew. Someone was watching. Garrett felt the familiar pull of fear, heavier than the storm before. But it was tempered now by awareness. By strategy. By the knowledge that retreat was not an option. You felt this before. The first moment when your choices become visible. When every step forward carries risk. When consequences arrive quietly, yet hit like a hammer. He retraced his steps mentally. Every post. Every email. Every subtle manipulation. Each had been calculated, deliberate, necessary. And now each had been noticed. Outside, the city moved with uncanny rhythm. Streetlights flickered. Subway trains paused unexpectedly. Pedestrians crossed streets a moment too late, almost as if someone nudged their perception. Garrett understood, the fracture was responding. Not in chaos. Not randomly. Deliberately. Strategically. A colleague approached him in the street later that day. Eyes darting. Voice low. You've stirred something, they said. And now you have to deal with it. Garrett nodded. He didn't need to ask questions. The implications were clear. The system didn't just react to mistakes. It retaliated. It tested boundaries. It pushed back in ways subtle enough to confuse, but powerful enough to manipulate. He returned to his apartment and mapped the ripple across a whiteboard. Arrows, nodes, and connections sprawled across the wall like a living organism. Each line represented influence. Each point, vulnerability. The pushback was no longer theoretical. It was tangible, affecting human behavior, schedules, and perception. And Garrett realized a crucial truth: every move he made from this point forward carried not just risk, but responsibility. A misstep could harm innocence. A correct move could unravel the network, or trigger escalation. The weight pressed down on him. His chest ached. His mind raced. Every decision felt monumental. But the storm had taught him resilience. The reveal had taught him insight. The fracture had taught him patience. And now, he would have to combine them. Move carefully. Predict precisely. Act decisively. Outside, the city hummed. Unaware. But Garrett knew, the consequences of the first strategic moves were only the beginning. The system had acknowledged him. And the system would not forget. A shadow crossed a street. A car slowed. A voice whispered in a cafe he passed. The pushback had begun. And the fracture was watching. The city pulsed with an eerie normalcy. Streetlights hummed. Neon reflections danced across wet asphalt. Subways groaned under the weight of commuters unaware of the storm swirling above their heads. Garrett moved with purpose, notebook clutched tight. Every detail mattered now. Every anomaly, every glance, every pause carried meaning. The pushback from his first moves had already arrived, and it was escalating. A meeting scheduled with an ally turned cold. Emails he thought secure vanished from his inbox. Subtle changes appeared everywhere, routines disrupted, timing altered, whispers of caution traveling faster than the traffic. You felt this before. The moment when the game you thought you understood becomes unpredictable. When control feels illusory. When the stakes are higher than you can articulate. Garrett realized the fracture was evolving. Not randomly. Deliberately. It learned from every action he took. It adapted, adjusted, countered. He followed a trail of subtle signals, a misaligned delivery, an out-of-place timestamp, a casual conversation loaded with meaning. Each clue built a pattern, a map of the network's response. And it was beautiful, and terrifying, in its precision. A colleague approached him in a quiet alley. Eyes darting. Voice low. "You've pushed too far," they whispered. "The network notices. And it will respond." Garrett nodded, internalizing the warning without yielding to fear. Fear was no longer his guide. Strategy was. He returned to his workspace. Whiteboards were covered in lines, nodes, arrows, and annotations. Patterns intersected with anomalies. Small contradictions revealed potential openings. And openings meant opportunity. At this point, every action carried risk. A misstep could expose him. A correct move could provoke escalation. Every choice had consequences, not just for him, but for anyone indirectly caught in the network's reach. Yet, in the tension, Garrett found clarity. The fracture could be influenced. It could be navigated. It could even be bent toward insight. But only if moves were precise, calculated, and relentless. You felt this before. The thrill of strategy. The rush of manipulating chaos without losing yourself. The awareness that every decision is simultaneously a risk and a tool. Garrett began to execute his plan. Small manipulations on public forums, private messages with coded language, subtle tests of human behavior. All designed to reveal the network's vulnerabilities. All designed to anticipate its counteractions. Outside, the city continued, unaware. Cars moved. Pedestrians walked. Streetlights flickered. But Garrett could feel the network pushing back in invisible ways. Delays, misdirections, subtle threats, veiled warnings. The stakes had never been higher. The consequences more immediate. And the fracture had proven it would respond. Garrett paused. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down. Every move mattered. Every step could accelerate escalation. Every decision could determine who survived, who faltered, and who remained in the shadows. And yet, he moved forward. Deliberate. Focused. Strategic. Because in chaos, clarity is power. And in the fracture, only those who act with precision can survive. The city exhaled around him, oblivious. The fracture pulsed in response. And Garrett, scarred, awake, and resolute, knew the game had changed. This was no longer observation. It was engagement. And engagement demanded courage, insight, and relentless calculation. Night fell, thick and almost suffocating. The streets glistened under streetlights, wet from a sudden drizzle. Garrett moved cautiously, each step measured, aware that the fracture was no longer just a distant pattern. It was immediate. Personal. Dangerous. The first strike came silently. A message on his encrypted phone, no sender, no signature. "We know what you did. We're watching. Step carefully." A warning. But also an invitation. To act. To respond. To test the system, and his own limits. He traced the digital footprint back, following the subtle cues embedded in the language. Each step revealed more than he expected. Patterns in surveillance, behavioral nudges, microtiming of communications. The network had adapted to his moves. It was learning, anticipating, testing him. You felt this before. The moment when danger feels both invisible and unavoidable. When every breath carries weight. When the line between strategy and survival blurs. Garrett moved through familiar streets, but everything had changed. Alleyways, neon signs, even the hum of the subway, all felt like extensions of the network. Observing. Waiting. Judging. He entered a diner, low-key, blending in, watching. The waitress recognized him, but her smile was tighter, controlled. "Coffee?" she asked, voice neutral. Garrett nodded, sensing subtle tension beneath the surface. The fracture had reached into ordinary life. And it would not relent. At a corner, a shadow moved, a figure stepping from the darkness. No words. Just presence. A reminder that observation was not one way. Garrett felt the subtle shift in air, the slight tightening of tension around him. He knew, the network had eyes on him now, constantly, everywhere. But retreat was not an option. He took a calculated risk. A direct maneuver, something bold and precise. He posted a seemingly innocuous comment online, but layered with hidden meaning, a trap for the network to reveal itself. Then he waited. Minutes passed. Hours, almost. And then the response came. Not visible. Not verbal. Behavior shifted. Patterns adjusted. Delays, misdirections, subtle nudges that could only mean one thing: the network had taken the bait. Garrett felt a surge of adrenaline. The fracture was reacting exactly as he had predicted. But the danger was immediate. Every movement, every decision, could trigger retaliation. He moved again, tracing subtle signals, anticipating reactions, mapping vulnerabilities. The network pushed back, testing him in ways he had anticipated, and some he had not. And he realized the truth. This was no longer a game of observation. It was combat. Mental, strategic, emotional combat. You felt this before. That electric awareness when stakes are highest. When each decision could make or break everything. When the fracture itself feels like a living adversary. Garrett pressed forward. Not recklessly. Not blindly. But with precision, focus, and relentless attention. He had stepped into the network. And now, the network had stepped into him. The city continued its rhythm outside, oblivious. But Garrett knew, the fracture, alive and adaptive, had marked him. And every move from now on would demand courage, insight, and calculation. The first direct confrontation had begun. And the real test was just starting. The night was alive with quiet tension. Rain-slicked streets reflected the glow of neon signs, stretching the city into fractured mirrors. Garrett moved through the darkness with purpose. Every step calculated. Every breath deliberate. The network was no longer abstract. It had noticed him. It had reacted. And now it tested him. You felt this before. The instant when the stakes feel enormous. When observation is not enough. And the only way forward is action. Garrett's first maneuver was subtle. A series of coded messages, layered with misinformation and half-truths, seeded across forums and encrypted channels. To an outside observer, they seemed inconsequential. To the network, they were a challenge. A probe. A trap. And the response came almost immediately. Small shifts in schedules, minor delays, and subtle changes in behavior revealed the network's reach. Every thread he tugged caused ripples, and Garrett mapped them meticulously. Each ripple told a story, exposed a weakness, offered insight into the hidden structure of the fracture. A colleague approached him unexpectedly at a diner the next morning. Their voice low, eyes darting, filled with both warning and intrigue. "You're pushing too hard." "They're watching." "They're learning." Garrett nodded. He had anticipated this. The fracture adapted, yes, but adaptation revealed patterns. And patterns could be exploited. Outside, the city carried on with eerie normalcy. Cars hummed along wet asphalt. Subway trains groaned beneath the streets. Pedestrians moved in rhythm, unaware of the invisible chessboard above them. Garrett executed the next step. He manipulated timing in meetings, subtle misalignments in communications, and inserted deliberate contradictions into public forums. The fracture responded. Delays, hesitations, micro-errors, human reactions, each carefully observed, each carefully noted. You've felt this before. The thrill of strategy under pressure. The exhilaration when risk and insight converge. When chaos bends under precision. And then came the first tangible payoff. A series of miscommunications caused two opposing threads within the network to collide. Confusion spread. Minor delays became significant. And Garrett had the evidence: the fracture was exploitable. It could be influenced. It could be bent. But the victory was precarious. Every intervention left traces. Every success risked exposure. The network adapted faster than ever. And retaliation, when it came, would be swift. Garrett paused. He sipped coffee, watching the steam rise and swirl. He noted the subtle movements of patrons. The hesitation of a barista placing a cup. The glance of a passerby at the window. Small details mattered. Every signal, every shift, every anomaly added to the map. And every anomaly was an opportunity. The fracture had made its first move. Garrett had responded. And now, the game had truly begun. Outside, the city pulsed with oblivious life. But Garrett knew the rhythm had changed. The fracture was alive, reactive, and relentless. And so was he. Because in the chaos, only precision mattered. Only awareness mattered. And only courage could bend the fracture toward clarity. The city had grown restless. Streetlights flickered as if signaling caution. Rain pattered softly against asphalt, masking footsteps yet amplifying tension. Garrett moved deliberately, senses sharp, aware that every shadow could conceal observation. The first strike came without warning. A colleague, someone he trusted, suddenly disappeared from scheduled meetings. Important communications vanished, replaced by cryptic errors. And then, a direct message. You've crossed a line. Expect consequences. The tone was calm. Clinical. But Garrett felt the weight behind the words. The network had responded. And it was personal. You've felt this before. The instant when your actions provoke reactions beyond expectation. When control becomes illusion. When the fracture becomes a living adversary. He traced subtle anomalies across digital and physical spaces. Messages rerouted, schedules altered, small acts of sabotage appearing almost organically. The network had adapted to his strategies, learned from his interventions, and now sought to challenge him directly. At a diner, a barista's glance lingered too long. Outside, shadows moved with unnatural awareness. A pigeon took flight at the exact moment Garrett crossed the street. Every detail was a signal. Every signal a test. Garrett realized the truth: the fracture wasn't just reactive, it was intelligent. It could predict behavior. Counter moves. Manipulate perception. And it was learning faster than he could track. But retreat wasn't an option. Not now. Not ever. He deployed a counter-strategy. Subtle misdirections, intentional contradictions, calculated risks. Each move was designed to reveal vulnerabilities in the network, to expose its patterns without triggering catastrophic consequences. And then the first direct confrontation occurred in person. A shadowy figure approached him outside his apartment building. No words at first. Just presence. A reminder that observation was not one way. You're getting too close, the figure finally said. You're poking at things that should remain hidden. Garrett's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not hiding," he said. "I'm understanding. And I'm acting." The figure's eyes narrowed. "Every action has cost. And some costs are irreversible." Garrett felt the moral tension tighten like a vice. Every decision carried weight. Every strategic move invited escalation. And the network, alive, adaptive, relentless, was testing him, probing weaknesses, predicting outcomes. You felt this before. The moment when the stakes are higher than ever. When the game feels both invisible and unavoidable. When survival depends on insight, courage, and timing. The confrontation ended as quickly as it began. The figure disappeared into shadows. The rain fell heavier. The city continued, oblivious, unaware of the invisible battle raging above its streets. Garrett paused, tracing patterns, recalculating strategies. Every micro-shift mattered. Every behavioral nuance was data. And every move forward carried risk, yet offered opportunity. The fracture had made its first direct move. Garrett had countered. And the game had escalated to a new level. Because now, he knew, the network didn't just respond. It retaliated. It adapted. It learned. And Garrett would have to do the same, relentlessly, deliberately, without hesitation. The storm was far from over. The fracture was alive, reactive, and unforgiving. And Garrett, scarred, alert, and strategic, understood this one immutable truth. To bend the fracture toward clarity, he had to anticipate retaliation, exploit patterns, and remain unbroken. The city exhaled around him, unaware. But Garrett knew, this was only the beginning. The city felt alive in a strange, tense rhythm. Rain-slicked streets mirrored the glow of flickering neon, stretching reflections like fractured mirrors. Garrett moved through them carefully, notebook in hand, mind calculating every probability, every risk. The network had struck. It had adapted. It had learned from his previous interventions. And now, the challenge was more personal, more urgent than ever. You felt this before. The moment when the line between observation and action blurs. When every choice carries immediate consequence. And the only way forward is to step deliberately into the unknown. Garrett's first maneuver was bold, a high-risk probe into a hidden communication channel within the network. If detected, it would mark him unmistakably. If successful, it would reveal critical weaknesses, vulnerabilities no one had anticipated. He moved with precision, leaving digital breadcrumbs that were both misleading and informative. Each action was layered with meaning. Every step calculated to provoke, test, and observe. And the network reacted. Microdelays, subtle misinformation, shifting behaviors, all signs that his probe had been noticed. The fracture responded, adaptive, calculating, almost, alive. But Garrett had anticipated this. The risk was expected. The reward, essential. At a diner, he observed patterns in human behavior, noting hesitation, tone, and timing. Small anomalies revealed the network's blind spots. Every interaction became a map, every glance a clue. Then came the first tangible payoff. A minor conflict within the network revealed a fracture deeper than he had imagined. Miscommunications collided. Systems overlapped incorrectly. And Garrett now had evidence. The network could be influenced, if approached with surgical precision. The moral stakes were immense. Every action affected people indirectly, even tangentially. A misstep could have ripple effects, causing harm far beyond what he anticipated. You felt this before. The thrill of insight under pressure. The rush when chaos bends to deliberate action. The tension when risk and consequence collide. Garrett pressed further. He manipulated digital signals, orchestrated subtle behavioral nudges, and adjusted timing to force the network into reaction. Each move was high risk. Each move offered high reward. And each response provided critical information. Outside, the city moved in oblivious rhythm. Cars hummed. Streetlights flickered. Pedestrians hurried by. Yet every step Garrett took felt electric, charged, consequential. The fracture had become a dance. He led. It followed. He tested. It responded. And then came the warning he had predicted. A figure appeared at the edge of his vision, lingering too long, watching. Not overtly threatening, but unmistakably aware. A reminder, every high-risk move invited retaliation. Garrett didn't flinch. He understood the stakes. He understood the game. He understood the fracture. And in that moment, clarity crystallized. To exploit the fracture, to bend it toward insight. He had to act decisively. Anticipate counter-moves. And remain unbroken, relentlessly aware, relentlessly strategic. The storm was intensifying. The fracture was alive, adaptive, unforgiving. And Garrett, scarred, alert, and precise, knew one immutable truth. In chaos, precision is power. In the fracture, awareness is survival. And in the network, courage determines the edge. The city's pulse had changed. Streetlights flickered in uneven rhythm. Rain-slicked roads reflected neon in fractured patterns. Garrett moved cautiously, aware that every shadow, every whisper, might conceal observation. The first blow came without warning. Communications he thought secure were intercepted. A colleague received subtle threats, coded, invisible to anyone outside the network. Minor errors compounded. Misalignments amplified. The fracture had learned. And it was striking back. You felt this before. The instant when the danger becomes tangible. When the system is no longer a distant structure. But a living adversary, responding to every move you make. Garrett observed patterns, tracing micro-errors and anomalies across digital and physical spaces. Subtle delays in schedules. Shifts in human behavior. Misdirected communications. The network was retaliating, but in its retaliation, it revealed openings. A diner, familiar, seemed off. The barista's hands trembled slightly while pouring coffee. A patron's gaze lingered, scanning, calculating. Every anomaly, no matter how small, became a clue. Garrett realized the opportunity. The fracture's retaliation, though aggressive, exposed critical vulnerabilities. Timing misalignments, communication overlaps, behavioral contradictions, each one a thread he could pull. The first direct engagement arrived. A figure stepped from shadows outside his apartment building, watching. No words at first. Presence alone carried threat and intent. You've pushed the boundaries, the figure said finally. And now you will feel the consequences. Garrett felt the weight of responsibility tighten. Every move forward carried risk, not just for himself, but for anyone indirectly touched by the network. And yet retreat was impossible. He responded with precision. A calculated probe, a subtle misdirection, a test of human behavior. He forced the network to react, revealing misalignments he could exploit. High risk, yes. High reward, absolutely. Minutes stretched into hours. Each second layered with tension. Every reaction from the network was observed, mapped, recorded. Patterns emerged from chaos. Vulnerabilities surfaced from retaliation. You felt this before. The thrill of strategy when stakes are extreme. The pulse in your chest when chaos bends to deliberate calculation. The awareness that every action, every choice, carries weight beyond comprehension. Garrett pressed further. Manipulating digital signals, behavioral cues, timing errors, he exploited the fracture's weaknesses. The network reacted, learned, adapted. And yet he remained one step ahead, anticipating its next moves, predicting outcomes, bending the system subtly toward insight. Outside, the city breathed, oblivious. Cars hummed along wet streets. Pedestrians walked, unaware of the invisible battlefield surrounding them. Rain fell heavier, masking footsteps, blending shadows. Garrett understood the truth: the fracture was alive. It retaliated. It adapted. It responded. But it was not invincible. And with precision, patience, and courage, he could bend it toward clarity. The first counterstrike had come. And Garrett had survived. But the game had only grown more dangerous. More complex. And more urgent. He was deep in the fracture now. Fully entangled. And there was no turning back. The night was heavy, thick with tension. Rain pattered against asphalt, merging with neon reflections that stretched the city into fractured illusions. Garrett moved with purpose, each step precise, each decision weighted with consequence. The network had retaliated. It had adapted. It had tested him at every turn. But now, he was ready to force a shift. You felt this before. The moment when the tide changes. When subtle moves become decisive. And the balance tilts in a way no one anticipated. Garrett's intervention was deliberate. Not reckless. Not overt. Surgical. He targeted the fracture's weaknesses revealed in prior encounters: timing misalignments, behavioral contradictions, and miscommunication nodes. A single message, coded and layered, was sent through multiple channels. To the outside observer, meaningless. To the network, a challenge, a trap. Then came the waiting. Seconds stretched. Minutes stretched. The city hummed obliviously outside. Cars glided over wet streets. Streetlights flickered with rhythm, shadows dancing in fractured reflections. And then, a response. Delays, micro-errors, and misalignments compounded. Threads of the network collided in confusion. Human behaviors shifted unpredictably, revealing cracks too wide to ignore. Garrett had forced the fracture to expose itself. The shift was immediate and palpable. The network, aggressive and adaptive, now reacted to him rather than dictating the rhythm. For the first time, Garrett held the advantage. You felt this before. The thrill of gaining control in chaos. The surge of insight when strategy bends reality. The knowledge that risk, carefully calculated, can alter outcomes dramatically. Outside, shadows moved. A figure lingered at the edge of perception, watching. Another test. Another challenge. But Garrett remained calm, focused, deliberate. He traced the network's responses in real time, adjusting interventions with precision. Each action exploited newly revealed vulnerabilities. Each counter-move by the network only confirmed his insight. The moral stakes were immense. Every thread he pulled could create ripple effects across human lives, digital systems, and the hidden fractures of power. Yet action was necessary. Inaction meant being consumed. And then came the culmination. A pattern emerged, clear and undeniable. The fracture had bent, momentarily, to his will. A subtle shift in timing. A misalignment of human behavior. An invisible lever pulled. The network had responded. It had revealed its structure, its weaknesses. And Garrett now had a path forward. You felt this before. The quiet triumph when chaos becomes opportunity. The awareness that precision, courage, and insight can change outcomes no one else perceives. The city outside breathed, oblivious. Rain fell heavier, masking footsteps. Streetlights flickered, shadows danced. And Garrett, alert, calculated, and resolute, knew one immutable truth. The fracture could be influenced. The fracture could be navigated. And with courage, strategy, and precision, the storm could be bent, not broken, but understood. The first decisive shift had been made. And the network, adaptive and relentless, would never be the same. The city felt heavier now. Rain-soaked streets mirrored fractured neon lights, stretching reflections into distorted lines that seemed almost intentional. Garrett moved deliberately, notebook in hand, calculating every possible consequence of his actions. The fracture had shifted. He had forced the network to reveal vulnerabilities. But that was only the beginning. You felt this before. The quiet moment after a bold move. When victory is fleeting. And danger still lurks beneath every shadow. Garrett's first task was consolidation. He mapped every change he had forced, tracing the ripple effects through the network, human behavior, and digital signals. Every adjustment, every realignment, every subtle misdirection needed to be accounted for. Small errors could unravel everything. He watched patterns in real time. Delays, miscommunications, behavioral contradictions, threads of the fracture that could be exploited further or patched before retaliation. Each anomaly became a node of control. Each response a test of his prediction. A diner provided the perfect vantage point. Steam rose from coffee cups, filling the air with warmth and a subtle haze. He observed patrons, timing glances, noting hesitation, tone, micro-movements. Even here, in ordinary life, the fracture left traces. And Garrett traced them meticulously. You felt this before. The tension of maintaining control. The thrill of observing chaos bend under deliberate calculation. And the knowledge that every action, every pause, every decision carries weight. But the network was not idle. It tested him, probed weak points, adapted to every intervention. And Garrett anticipated retaliation. He predicted moves, countered subtly, forced errors, and exploited openings with surgical precision. A figure appeared outside the diner, lingering in shadow. Eyes sharp, posture deliberate. A silent message, the network was watching. Every step he took, every strategic intervention, was now under scrutiny. Garrett didn't flinch. He adjusted, calculated, and acted. Small maneuvers, timed interventions, subtle manipulations, all designed to secure gains while forcing the network to reveal its next moves. The storm had reached a critical point. He had seized the advantage. But the fracture was alive, adaptive, and relentless. Every success now came with heightened stakes. You felt this before. The knowledge that victory is provisional. That observation is never passive. And that every edge comes with responsibility. Garrett traced patterns late into the night. Each anomaly recorded. Each misalignment exploited. Each potential retaliation anticipated. The fracture had bent to his influence, but it would not submit quietly. The network would strike. It would test him. It would escalate in ways he could not yet fully predict. And yet, he remained resolute. Focused. Calculated. Because the first decisive shift had given him a rare truth. The fracture could be understood. It could be navigated. And with courage, insight, and precision, the storm could be bent toward clarity. Outside, the city exhaled under flickering streetlights and heavy rain. But Garrett knew the final confrontation was near. The fracture would push back. And he had to be ready. The city held its breath. Rain-slicked streets glimmered under fractured neon lights. Every reflection seemed deliberate, every shadow a silent witness. Garrett moved with unwavering focus, aware that the culmination of every move, every decision, every risk led to this moment. The network had reacted to everything he had done. Retaliated, adapted, tested, but tonight, the balance would shift. He could feel it in the rhythm of the city, in the hesitation of footsteps, in the tension that clung to the air. You felt this before. The instant when preparation meets confrontation. When every calculation, every observation, every risk converges. And clarity demands action. Garrett engaged the network decisively. Every maneuver, every subtle probe, every manipulation of timing and behavior converged into a single, coordinated effort. Patterns he had traced, vulnerabilities he had exposed, misalignments he had forced, all became tools in his hands. The first countermove arrived swiftly. Signals, behavioral shifts, and micro-errors rippled across the cityscape. The network struck, adaptive and relentless. But Garrett anticipated each strike. He bent the storm, guiding its energy into openings, exploiting weaknesses, and forcing the fracture into positions it could not escape. A figure emerged from the shadows, silent, observing. The same presence that had haunted his steps through diners, alleys, and rain-soaked streets. No words were spoken. Presence alone conveyed warning and intent. "You've pushed far enough," the figure said. "Do you understand what you're tampering with?" Garrett met the gaze, calm, precise, unbroken. "I understand it," he replied. "I can navigate it. I can bend it. But I will not be paralyzed by it." The fracture responded violently, unexpected misalignments, cascading errors, chaotic human reactions. But Garrett remained deliberate. Every move anticipated, every counter anticipated, every reaction used as leverage. "You've felt this before. The edge of chaos. When clarity emerges only through courage and insight. When survival depends on intellect, awareness, and heart." Minutes stretched, tension mounting. The storm of the network surged, threatened, tested, but Garrett had created leverage. A decisive maneuver, subtle but powerful, forced the fracture to reveal its final weakness. The moment crystallized. The network, alive, adaptive, relentless, was revealed in its entirety. Patterns, behaviors, signals, misalignments, all exposed, all traceable. And Garrett had mastery, if only for this moment. The city exhaled, oblivious. Cars glided over wet asphalt. Streetlights flickered. Pedestrians passed without noticing the invisible battle that had just concluded. Garrett stepped back, notebook in hand, and reflected. The fracture was not destroyed. It could not be. It was alive, adaptive, chaotic. But it had been understood. It had been mapped. And it had been bent, if only temporarily, to insight and clarity. "You've felt this before. The quiet after triumph. The awareness that understanding is its own kind of power. That courage, calculation, and precision can turn chaos into clarity." Garrett looked up at the rain-streaked sky. The city pulsed around him. He had survived the fracture. He had influenced the storm. And he had learned its language. Freedom isn't inherited. It's practiced. And insight isn't granted. It's earned. So when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? And maybe, this is where everything begins again.